The summer, the incubators failed. Everyone in the valley already knew what Maris Veldy was worth, which is to say they had decided she was worth very little. She stood that August afternoon in the long low barn behind the Kellerman hatchery complex with 300 cracked duck eggs in wooden flats around her feet, and $47 left in her checking account. And the room smelled of warm straw and old wood and something beneath that ancient and patient. The smell of possibility that most people had long ago learned not to notice. The buyers from Kellerman's operation had pulled the clean eggs into refrigerated transport and left the cracked ones for the dump run, and Maris had waited until their truck was out of sight before asking the foreman if she could have the rejects. He had paused. He had looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has asked a question so simple it must be a joke. Then he said, "Take them. Take whatever you like," and he had not laughed until she was already loading her truck. She heard it as she drove away. It carried a long time on the flat morning air. She let it carry. She had learned, in the months since arriving in the valley, with a leased property and a second-hand incubation setup and no reputation at all, that she could either spend her energy answering other people's conclusions, or she could spend it on the work, and the work was the only one of those two things that would ever pay her back. Here is what you need to understand about cracked duck eggs before the rest of this story makes its full sense. A crack is not the same as a death. A crack is an insult to a membrane, a small vulnerability in the armor, and whether what lives inside survives depends entirely on what happens next, on humidity held precisely, on temperature maintained with a patience that amounts almost to reverence, on the willingness of the steward to sit with uncertainty. Most hatcheries pulled cracked eggs from the incubation lines because the commercial logic was unforgiving. A cracked egg carried infection risk and demanded extra attention, and in a facility running 40,000 eggs at a time, extra attention per unit was a cost that could not be absorbed. So the cracked eggs went to the dump pile, and the question of what was living inside them was a question nobody asked, because asking it was economically irrational. Maris Veldy was not, at this stage of her life, in a position to be economically rational. She was in a position to be something older and stranger and more stubborn than rational, which was attentive, which was patient, which was willing to make a bet that looked like foolishness from the outside and felt from the inside, like the only honest thing to do. The refrain she had brought from her grandmother's kitchen table, written on a card that sat now on her windowsill above the incubation room, said this: "A crack is a map of what it survived, not a sentence on what it can become." She had heard her grandmother say it about people, about pottery, about a marriage, and she applied it now to 300 eggs in wooden flats. The old woman who would soon become her neighbor had told her in accented, measured syllables, "The land does not forget a single season. It keeps every rain and every drought in its body, like a ledger. You must learn to read that ledger before you plant a single thing." The eggs were a ledger of their own, each crack a record of some small incident of handling, each one still sealed enough to hold its warmth if she moved quickly. She drove the flat valley road back to the leased property with the wooden flats in the truck bed and the windows down because it was 91 degrees and the truck had no air conditioning. She had come to the valley 6 months before from a city where she had worked 12 years managing microbial cultures in a commercial laboratory, which meant she understood, in a cellular and literal sense, the difference between a condition that supported life and a condition that destroyed it. Even when the two conditions looked nearly identical from the outside. She had left the laboratory after her mother's death and a long, quiet winter of reassessment, and she had come because a lease had opened on 40 acres nobody else wanted, a property that sat low between two slight rises and collected water in ways that made it prone to pooling in wet years and prone to nothing much in dry ones. She had told the leasing agent she intended to raise ducks. He had nodded in the careful way that means I am choosing not to say what I am thinking, taken her deposit, and driven away. Her early arithmetic was this: a good Pekin duck, hatched and grown to market weight in 11 weeks, sold at farmers' markets, and to restaurants for between $4 and $6 per bird at a small-scale operation. She had researched the valley's market, identified restaurants in the city 40 miles north that sourced locally and paid a premium, and secured a farmer's market vendor slot running May through October. She had budgeted for 200 birds to start, which required a modest incubation setup. She had purchased secondhand from a closing poultry operation 2 counties over. The $47 now remaining in her account after 6 months of lease payments and equipment purchases and feed infrastructure told her that her timeline had compressed and that the 300 cracked eggs in the truck bed were not a windfall or a plan. They were a problem that might be better than nothing, or might be nothing. And the only way to know was to begin. She pulled the flats from the truck before the eggs had time to cool and carried them to the side room where the incubators waited, and she worked 4 hours sealing each crack with a diluted beeswax mixture from a 1987 poultry extension pamphlet she had found at the county library, applying it with a small brush, letting it set, turning each egg to check the seal. She worked by the light of a single hanging bulb and did not stop to eat. By midnight, she had sealed 261 eggs, well enough to try. The remaining 39 were too far compromised, and she composted them herself, which felt honest. A small acknowledgement that not every cracked thing can be brought back. At 1 in the morning, he sat on the floor, with her back against a warm incubator cabinet, and ate a peanut butter sandwich, and looked at the 261 sealed eggs and did the arithmetic. If 20% hatched, she had 52 birds. If 50% hatched, she had 130. She decided to believe the pessimist's number so that anything more would be a gift she had not presupposed. The old woman came on the 3rd morning. Her name was Theodora Ballas, and she was 79 years old and had lived on the neighboring 8 acres for 31 years, and she had grown up in a part of Central Europe where ducks were not a specialty product, but simply the animal that got you through a winter when nothing else would. She appeared at the barn door with a jar of something preserved in brine, and looked at Maris without the careful nodding performance of unspoken skepticism and said, "I heard you took Kellerman's cracked eggs." Maris said she had. Theodora said, "Good." She came inside, looked at the incubation setup, was quiet for a while, then said, "You sealed with wax." "My mother used tallow, but wax is better. Wax breathes less. The egg needs to breathe a little, but not too much. You did right." Then she sat down on a bucket and said the thing Maris would carry the rest of the season. "The egg already knows whether it wants to live. Your job is only to not convince it. Otherwise, whatever pressure you add is pressure it has to spend on you instead of on becoming. Hold the temperature. Turn them gentle. Don't look too often. Looking too often is its own kind of harm." She came 3 more times that first week, each time staying between 20 minutes and an hour, each time saying something Maris wrote down afterward on the back of the incubation log. She talked about temperature differentials and about how ducks differed from chickens in the middle days of incubation, more tolerant of certain fluctuations, but less tolerant of others. She brought a candling lamp she had made from a coffee tin and a bulb socket, and showed Maris how to read the shadows inside the shell, and she said, "The shell tells you everything if you know the language." Most people never bother to learn the language because they have already decided whether the egg is worth their attention. The child came on the 7th day. His name was Pell Osterhagen, and he was 10 years old, and his family leased land on the far side of Theodora's property, a spread in marginal financial difficulty for most of Pell's life. He appeared at the fence line one morning and stood without calling out, just watching, and when Maris waved, he came through the gap in the fence the way a child who has spent time around agricultural fencing always knows where the gap is. He looked at the incubation room and said, "Those are Kellerman's rejects." It was not a question. She said yes. He said, "My dad said you were going to lose all your money on them." She said he might be right. Pell considered this, then said, "Can I help?" She gave him the turning log and showed him the schedule, and he came back every day after school and on weekends without being asked, turning the eggs at the afternoon shift. With a steadiness that surpassed, she noted privately the steadiness of several adults she had known. He named the incubation trays after letters of the alphabet and kept his own count in a small notebook. He did not ask her about money. He did not ask what she would do if it failed. He asked about duck biology, about air cells and development stages. And she told him everything she knew, which was considerably more than the valley currently credited her with knowing. The first candling at day 7 revealed 144 fertile eggs developing normally, 63 unclear or very early, and 54 already lost. She removed the lost eggs and recorded the number with the same steadiness she had decided to bring to every figure this season. 144 was better than 20%. She did not celebrate. She said to Pell, 144. So far he wrote it down. She turned back to the calibration dial and held her breath against the small flicker of hope that had moved through her like a bird crossing a window. The valley had its idea of her by then, calcified quickly and thoroughly in the way community opinions do when the subject has not yet accumulated enough presence to complicate the story. She had heard a version of it from the woman at the feed co-op, said without cruelty and with a reportorial plainness. The word was that a city woman had leased the Hartman Low Acres and was trying to hatch Kellerman's garbage and would be gone by fall. The story existed alongside the version held by Harlan Dreer, who ran the valley's largest poultry operation. Some 3,200 birds under a processing contract with 2 regional grocery chains. Dreer had called on Maris in March, uninvited, in the gracious and overbearing way of a man who has never been told no by anyone with less money than himself. He had walked the property with his hands in his pockets and told her the Hartman Low Acres were tricky land, prone to problems, and that he was in a position to absorb the lease if she found herself overwhelmed, as a courtesy neighbor to neighbor. The figure he named was so far below what she had paid in deposits that she understood it was not a number but a demonstration of his contempt dressed as generosity. She said she appreciated the offer and was not interested. He had nodded the careful nod and driven back out the gravel lane without looking at her again. Dreer came a second time in late April, after word spread that she was incubating Kellerman's cracked seconds. He brought a man from a hatchery consortium 2 counties over, and the consortium man said, in the tone of someone delivering a medical prognosis, that the liability exposure on cracked egg incubation was considerable, that there were county health ordinances touching on commercial poultry at certain scales, that he had connections with the county agricultural office, and was sure everyone wanted to keep things above board. Maris said her operation was under the scale threshold for county inspection, and that she had confirmed this in writing with the county extension office in February, before signing a single document. The consortium man looked at Dreer. Dreer looked at Maris. She held the door open with the same expression she held all her numbers, and they left. The second candling, on day 14, showed 111 eggs with strong development. 25 were removed. 76 showed variable but potential development, and she left them in. Theodora came that evening, looked at the log, and said, "The egg that survives a crack often hatches harder than the ones that never had one. It has already learned something about persistence." Maris wrote this on the back of the log. By mid-June, the valley had received 3 weeks of below-normal rainfall, not yet a crisis, but beginning to shade into concern. Dreer's operation used significant well water in its processing facility, and the water table in the higher elevations was dropping faster than anyone had seen since the dry year 7 years before. Maris's low acres, the ones everyone considered a liability for their pooling tendency, had turned out to hold moisture at depths the drier sections of the valley could not match. Her kitchen garden along the eastern edge was producing when others were struggling. She noted this without speaking of it, the way she had learned to note everything that could go wrong, by noting also in the same ledger what was going quietly right. The hatch began on day 26, a Thursday morning in mid-June, and Maris was in the side room at 4 in the morning because she had not slept and had learned to trust her body's sense of when to be present. The first pip appeared in a tray B egg, one of Pell's designations, and she sat with it in the dim warmth and watched it work. And she did not help it, because Theodora had said with simple directness, "Do not help. Whatever needs to happen is already happening inside." A duckling that cannot break its own shell has not yet decided to live. What you can do is hold the air right and stay out of the way. So she held the air right, and at 6:15 the first duckling came out wet and exhausted and very loud. She called Pell, and when he arrived, an hour later a second had pipped and a third was working. And Pell sat on the floor cross-legged and watched with the focused, wordless attention of a child who does not yet know he is supposed to have a shorter attention span than this. By the end of the hatch window, through day 28, she had 89 living ducklings. 89 birds from 211 viable candidates was a 42% hatch rate, well above the pessimist's number, and it converted at the low end of her price assumptions to a gross revenue potential somewhere between $350 and $530, which would not restore her account to any meaningful level, but which was a beginning she could stand on. She went to the brooder area she had set up in the long barn's main room, watched 89 wet and indignant ducklings discover the world, and found to her mild embarrassment that she was crying. Though she had told herself in March that she was not going to be a person who cried about ducks, Theodora came that evening with a bottle of something homemade and 2 glasses, and looked at the ducklings for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "89, from the dump pile." Maris said, "Yes." Theodora said, in the cadence of someone quoting something very old, "The valley doesn't give you what you planned for. It gives you what you're paying enough attention to deserve." Maris wrote this on the windowsill card below her grandmother's line. The 2 sentences sat together there all summer. July arrived like someone had left the oven door open and forgotten to close it. The heat came in the second week and did not leave, sustained and bone deep, arriving before dawn and staying past 10 at night, drawing moisture out of the ground with a thoroughness that felt personal. The small creek along the eastern edge of Dreer's main property dropped to a thin brown thread by the 3rd week of July. His wells continued to produce, but at reduced pressure, and his processing facility required a certain flow to operate at licensed capacity. This information reached Maris in fragments, through Theodora and through Pell, who heard what his father said at the dinner table and reported it with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to curate what he shares. Dreer came a 3rd time in late July. Wada. He came alone, stood at the barn door, looked at the 89 ducks, now 6 weeks old, and moving around the barn's main room with the deliberate confidence of animals who have decided they own the space, and said, looking at the water basins along the low east wall rather than at her, "You're not hurting for water." She said no. He said his operation was having some challenges with water availability, and he would like to revisit the conversation about the lease and was prepared to be more generous than before. He named a figure. It was higher than March and lower than what she had spent. She said she was still not interested. He said he admired her position and understood it must be difficult out here alone, a woman alone, and he said it the way that phrase gets said when it is meant to imply fragility rather than describe a fact, a reminder of what you lack rather than a description of what you are. She said she had work to do and thanked him for stopping by. He drove out the gravel lane, and she watched the dust settle behind his truck and felt something clarify in her chest, a cold and useful anger which she put directly into the afternoon's work, which was the best place she had ever found for it. By early August, the ducks were at 7 weeks, and she had begun selling. She had secured the farmer's market slot and was selling processed birds on Saturdays, and she had reached out to a restaurant in the city she had researched carefully, a place whose chef sourced locally and maintained a clientele willing to pay for provenance. The chef, a compact and skeptical woman named Irina. who had cooked for 20 years and was not interested in being charmed, only in being shown, had walked through the barn and looked at the birds and said, "These are calm birds." You can always tell a badly managed flock, because the birds are afraid when you move through them. Yours aren't afraid. She had offered a standing purchase order for 12 processed birds per week at a price per bird $11 above the lowest price Maris had planned for and $3 above the highest. Maris said she could do 12 per week beginning the following Friday. Before she got in her car, Irina said, "Where did you source the eggs?" Maris said, "Kellerman's dump pile." There was a pause. Irina said, "Seriously?" Maris said, Irina laughed, a short, genuine sound of surprise, and then appreciation, and drove away. August moved forward in its furnace way, and the valley's water situation worsened. The creek feeding the small municipal reservoir on the north end of town dropped to a level that prompted the county to issue a conservation advisory, and then, in the third week of August, a usage restriction applying to large-scale agricultural operations above a certain daily water draw. Dreer's processing facility fell above the threshold. His grow-out capacity, the birds he had contracted to deliver to the grocery chains, was now in jeopardy. Because you cannot raise birds to contract weight on restricted water in a summer like this one. He came to the Valley's monthly meeting of the Small Agricultural Operations Association, held in the back room of the feed co-op. Maris had been attending since April, mostly quiet, largely treated as a minor presence. Dreer walked in, walked straight past her, stood at the front of the room, and told the assembled producers he had a water access problem and was proposing a cooperative water-sharing agreement that would allow his processing facility to draw from the shared municipal reserve under a new priority arrangement. In exchange, he would offer guaranteed processing contracts to the small producers, who signed on. The price he named for those contracts was the lowest she had ever seen calculated for small flock poultry in this region, a price that would have destroyed the margin of every independent producer in the room and made all of them permanently dependent on Dreer's processing infrastructure, which is to say permanently dependent on Dreer. The room went quiet, in the way rooms do when what's been said is too large to answer immediately. Most people were looking at their hands or at the ceiling. Several of them had, at various points in the past 6 months, laughed at the idea of the woman on the low-lease acres hatching Kellerman's garbage, and several of them were now frightened in a physical and immediate way about the coming months. Maris sat in the third row and said nothing for a moment. She looked at the faces in the room, and she looked at the number she had been carrying in her head all month, the capacity of the groundwater beneath the Hartman low acres. The low acres held because the water table beneath them was fed by a subsurface seam that a state extension survey she had requested in March described as a remnant alluvial deposit of significant porosity. There was water under her land in quantities the surrounding valley could not match this dry year. She had the survey in her truck. She raised her hand. Dreer looked at her with polite condescension and said, "Yes." She stood. She asked whether the cooperative agreement would extend to all participants equally, or whether Dreer's operation would hold priority draw rights. He said all participants would share equally, according to operational need. She said she was asking because the priority arrangement he described was not legal under the current county ordinance unless voted on by a 2/3 majority of affected landowners, which she was fairly certain this room did not constitute because it excluded several landowners in the northern section of the valley who would be affected. She said the county extension office had the ordinance, and she had a copy herself, requested in writing in March, and it was in her truck if anyone wanted to see it. The man who ran the orchard on the north slope said he would go get it. She handed him her keys. He went. Dreer's expression had not changed. He was watching her with the attention of a man recalculating, and it was in this moment that he made his error, the error of a man who has been gathering intelligence on an opponent he has been publicly dismissing. He said in a tone aimed at the room rather than at her, "I appreciate the concern, but I've reviewed the water table data for the valley, and my information is that the Hartman Acres subsurface deposit is not as robust as you might be hoping. His information was specific. It named the aquifer layer by its geological designation and cited a porosity estimate within a narrow range. That estimate was one he could not have known from any public document. The state extension survey she had received was not public. She had not shared it. She had spoken of it to exactly one person, Theodora, and Theodora did not share things with men who stood in barn doorways discussing what a woman alone could and could not manage. The only way Dreer's consortium had that specific figure was if someone from his operation had accessed her mailed correspondence, which had arrived in a county extension envelope at the leased property address in March and had sat in her desk drawer since. Which meant someone had been on her property and in her office while she was elsewhere. She said, very quietly, "That's an interesting figure. May I ask where you sourced it?" He paused. She said she was asking because the number was quite close to a figure in a state extension survey she had received in March, and she did not recall sharing that document with anyone outside the property. The room had gone completely still. The orchard man who had returned with the county ordinance and was standing near the door was looking between Dreer and Maris with the alert expression of someone watching a card game, where a player has just revealed a card he should not have had. Dreer said the figure was publicly available through the County Geological Survey Office. She said it was not, and she said this without heat because she had called the County Geological Survey Office in May and confirmed precisely what was and was not publicly filed. She said she would be happy to follow up with the County Survey Office directly, and she believed the County Agricultural Commissioner's Office would probably be interested in that conversation as well. She sat down. She had said everything she intended to say. The room did the rest. What happened in the next 10 minutes was not dramatic in the way confrontations are dramatic in stories. It was quiet in the way true turnings are quiet. Dreer gathered his papers and said something about following up in writing, and he left, and the room exhaled, and the conversations that followed were not about his water-sharing proposal, which nobody seconded or voted on, but about the aquifer under the Hartman Low Acres and whether Maris Velde would be willing to discuss shared access on terms that were not Dreer's terms. The orchard man said he was interested. The woman who ran the goat dairy on the eastern slope said she was interested. 3 other operations said they were interested. Maris said she needed a week to talk to the county extension office and look at the numbers and would come back with a fair proposal. And she said, fair meaning equitable, meaning based on what each operation needed rather than on what each could be made to pay in desperation. And she said the word fair in a tone that required no elaboration, because everyone in the room had just watched its opposite perform itself and walk out through the feed co-op's back door. She stopped at Pell's family's property on the way home. She had been stopping once a week since July, trading eggs and early-season produce from the kitchen garden for help with the afternoon turning rotation, an arrangement she had set up as a business exchange rather than a charity. She went to the door and said to Pell's father, a quiet man who had been farming this valley for 15 years with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to margins thinner than he deserved, I want to talk to you about water access. Your property sits close enough to the south edge of the subsurface seam that I think you might benefit from what's under mine, and I'd like to run that by the extension office and sit down with you about what a shared arrangement would look like. He stood in the door and said after a moment, My boy says, You know what you're doing out there. She said Pell was a fine hand. He said with the restraint of a man who does not spend words freely, I should have said so before. I didn't. She said there was time now, and she meant it. The rains came in the second week of September, 2 weeks earlier than the valley's historical average, and when they came properly. Not a relief shower, but a soaking 3-day event that sat over the valley and refilled the reservoir and turned the Brown Creek thread back into a creek. Maris stood in the barn doorway on the second morning of the rain and listened to the ducks in the run, who greeted rainfall with a unanimous enthusiasm she found, even now, deeply funny. 81 of the 89 remained, 8 lost to various causes across the summer, and the 81 were strong birds. Irina's standing order had continued every week. The numbers in her account were no longer $47, not substantial yet, but no longer the arithmetic of someone about to lose. And the arithmetic of not losing, she had learned this summer, was its own kind of gain. Theodora came on the third day, when the sky had cleared and the valley was wet and reflecting and smelled like itself again, the deep, particular smell of soil that has been very dry for a long time and is now being reminded of what it actually is. She brought the preserved brine again, and sat on the bucket and looked at the birds and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "I told you in March, the valley keeps a ledger. You've been paying into it all year." She nodded at the ducks. "Those were Kellerman's garbage." Maris said they were. Theodora said, "Now, they are 81 arguments that a crack is not a sentence." She stood with the deliberate care of a 79-year-old woman who has been careful with her body because she needed it to last, and she patted Maris on the arm once, which was an unusual gesture from her and which Maris understood as the full weight of what it was, and she walked back across the fence line in the afternoon light. Pell came after school and updated the outcome log without being asked, adding the September numbers in careful handwriting. He said without looking up, "My dad thinks you might have saved his operation." She said the aquifer was there, whether she had pointed at it or not. He said, "But you pointed at it." She said that was true. He wrote something in his notebook, and she did not ask what. She had learned that Pell's notebook was his own ledger and not a thing you asked about. At the November Association meeting, Dreer did not attend. Maris brought the County Extension Office's preliminary assessment of the subsurface water sharing arrangement and walked through the numbers with the assembled producers. She proposed a cost-sharing model for the pump infrastructure that distributed expense in proportion to each operation's draw, and that included Pell's family's operation at a reduced contribution rate in recognition of their proximity to the seam's edge and the uncertainty of their draw volume. The orchard man seconded without hesitation. It passed by unanimous vote. She signed the cooperative agreement last, after everyone else, because she did not need to be first. Being first was a thing she had already done, in March, in the dark, with a beeswax brush and 300 eggs from the dump pile. And she had done it alone, and she had done it without anyone watching. And that was the version that mattered to her, the one that happened before the vindicating in the voting and the reversal of the community's careful nod. By the following spring, she had expanded the incubation setup with 2 additional refurbished units from the same closing operation she had used the first time. And she had a standing arrangement with Kellerman's foreman for the cracked egg dump poles, which the foreman had formalized in writing after she brought him a processed bird from the Irina batch. And he took it home and reported back that his wife said it was the best duck she had ever cooked. She paid 40 cents per egg for the rejected pull, above what the compost processor paid, and below what whole eggs sold for, and the arrangement suited both of them. Pell came every day after school and had started keeping a parallel incubation log, his own version, more detailed than hers in certain respects, and she was privately certain it would outpace her methods within 2 years. She intended to tell him so when the time was right. She stood in the barn one early morning in May. A year and some months from the afternoon, she had loaded the wooden flats into her truck and driven out of the Kellerman lot with the foreman's laughter trailing behind her on the flat air, and she listened to the sound of the barn, loud now in the best way. The constant commentary of ducks going about their business, the sound that had been her first arithmetic's target and her long season's proof. She thought about Dreer's phrase, "a woman alone," and how he had meant it as a reduction, a statement of what was absent rather than what was present, a thing to be pitied or leveraged. And how by now it had become something entirely different in her own accounting. A woman alone in the incubation room at midnight, making the decision that everyone had already decided was irrational. A woman alone in the early morning reading the language of the shell that most people had decided was not worth learning. A woman alone on the low lease acres that everyone had decided collected problems rather than resources. That aloneness had not been a deficit, but a kind of undiluted attention. The attention Theodora had named, and that Pell had inherited, and that the land itself, in its patient geological way, had been offering all along to anyone willing to hold the conditions and stay out of the way. A crack is a map of what it survived, not a sentence on what it can become. She had said it to Pell once, in July, when he asked about the card on the windowsill. He had looked at it a moment and said, "That's also true about people, isn't it?" She had said her grandmother had thought so. He had nodded and gone back to the turning log. She had stood in the doorway of the side room and looked at the incubators running quiet and warm in the summer heat, and thought about the valley which had cracked in its own way this dry season. The creek gone thin, and the wells dropping, and the fear sitting in people's chests like a weight they were too proud to name. The valley was not done yet, not sentenced by the drought, and the answer to a crack was not to hide it or declare it a total loss, but to seal it carefully with what you had available, and hold the temperature, and turn it gently, and not look too often, and trust that what wanted to live would find its way to living if you held the conditions and stayed out of. Way the valley kept its ledger. She was in it now, and not as a footnote.
En tout cas, c'est vraiment avec allez les 500! Oui, en général, quand, Greg, il parle, il y a un G devant. Oui, je suis avec Sakura, Suki, Umi, Babou, Sadala, tout le monde. OK, il y a pas de souci, bah, fais-leur des bisous. Qu'est-ce que TikTok, il y a personne. TikTok, il y a zéro personne. Mais c'est pas grave, pas grave. Du coup, vous voulez jouer à quoi ce soir, les copains? On joue à quoi? Mais en tout cas, je suis contente que tu aies pu passer, Jenny. Tu dû entendre qu'on parlait de toi, du coup. Ah merde! Tu vas pas pouvoir jouer, Alix? Ouais, ça risque de faire comme la dernière fois. Et bonjour! Coucou accro, comment ça